I would like to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Cramer, who has graciously agreed to be part of the TED Diversity Caucus video project. My name is Maria A. Silva, and I am a doctoral student at Florida International University. Dr. Cramer has over 20 years of experience working in the field of special education. She has authored and co-authored dozens of scholarly articles that primarily focus on education of high-need children in inclusive urban settings. She has served as principal investigator on several educational grants and research projects. And additionally, she has supported several professional societies, including the Council for Exceptional Children in varying capacities. Thank you so much, Dr. Cramer, for supporting this project.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So can we start? Could you please tell us your role, your institution, and as well as your scholarly interests?
Sure. So as Maria mentioned, I'm currently a professor of special education at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I also serve as the graduate program director for the Department of Teaching and Learning, which means I oversee all of the graduate programs within teacher education here at FIU. And my scholarly interests focus around the education of high-need children in inclusive urban settings, like you said. My work tends to focus around educational outcomes for students who are multiply minoritized in terms of race, ethnicity, language, social class, and ability. And I also center my work around preparing educators in culturally sustaining practices to meet the diverse needs of multiply minoritized students.
Thank you. Can you share with us, what are your goals as a graduate student educator?
Sure. So my goals are for my graduates to carry out the important work of ensuring equitable and accessible quality education to all learners. So basically, it's my hope that I'm instilling a sense of socio-political consciousness to the next generation of researchers, leaders, practitioners in the field of special education. Honestly, nothing makes me prouder than the thought that my graduates will go on and shape this field beyond what I ever personally could have done. And I am particularly also aware of the importance of diversifying the future leadership workforce. And I try to create programs that attract, support, retain in the field stellar scholars of color and other scholars from typically underrepresented groups. And that's important to me in educational roles, both in higher education, so like future professors, as well as those who will serve as leaders and practitioners in K-12 schools.
Well, I can attest that you've definitely supported me very much, and I can't wait to be included in the group of your graduates someday.
I look forward to that.
How does your focus and research integrate and address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are there particular frameworks or research interests that are particularly key in addressing these issues in your work?
Sure. So in my roles, my current roles, a great deal of my day-to-day work is actually in the preparing of diverse scholars around these issues. So around issues of urban inclusive education, around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And because of that, I'm able to integrate my research, my service, and my teaching so that these areas are really aligning and permeating all aspects of my career. So a great deal of my time these days, as you know, is mentoring diverse doctoral students toward addressing these same issues in their own budding careers. Earlier in my career, I would say a lot of my past research has been methodologically, I've used a lot of mixed methods because I always felt like I could take advantage of using data that exists, like student achievement data, student placement data as a starting ground. And then I could dig more deeply into these issues using more qualitative approaches. So interviews, observations, that sort of thing, focus groups. I have always tried to steer away in my work from deficit perspectives. So I've embraced the work of Bourdieu and later Yasso. And I particularly like Yasso's applications of critical race theory and Bourdieu's earlier work into her concept of cultural wealth. I try to apply that to both the scholars that I'm recruiting and supporting, as well as my approach to looking at situations within the K-12 schools.
Okay, so I think you touched a little bit on this, but to what extent have you seen your scholarship influencing teacher education in practice?
So I think actually some of the most influential work I've probably done was very early in my career. I started off as a doctoral student working on a large research project looking at disproportionality, and I, as an assistant professor, continued to do research around those areas. I've been in the field, like you mentioned, over 20 years now. So I've actually seen some growth in these areas as far as how we diagnose students, how we place students, how we can start intervening a little earlier. But there's definitely still a lot of work to be done. Sadly, a lot of the same issues I was studying earlier in my career still persist. One thing I have noticed though, is that the type of research that I do around these urban issues and these intersectionalities, I think it used to be seen as maybe less mainstream, or like fringe research that was mostly, if published at all, published in urban focused journals, or, you know, a little less of the mainstream journals. And I do think that I see now when I'm reading the mainstream journals in the field, these are the topics that are being published about in the more mainstream text now. So I think there has been a shift in the field over time toward that. However, I do think, like I said, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I do think one thing that has improved, and I'm not crediting this to my work, but I'm seeing this growth over time, is that I think there is a more widely recognized awareness of just how complex these nuances are and how much systemic inequities really permeate all of education, but particularly special ed for students with multiple markers of difference.
Yeah, I definitely think we can all agree that there has been progression in special education, albeit slow, but there's still a lot of more work to be done. And we've really highlighted a lot more critical issues that need to be focused on, which leads me to my next question. In one of your more recent articles, Cramer et al. 2018, you described the need to expand the conversations in education to address these critical issues. So specifically, I'm going to read a quote that you wrote that I really appreciated. We must reframe the conversation toward individual students to ensure equity of opportunity. We cannot remain at the current policy level that views students solely as a collective group, but rather we need to consider policy that recognizes the individual in a way that can lead to success. So can you expand a little bit on these thoughts?
Sure. So this piece was written, it was published in 2018. It was written obviously a little bit before that because that's how things work. But it was written at a time when we were really in the heart of the accountability movement, where at this point, most states were adopting some form of standardized curriculum, whether Common Core or their own state standards. And teachers were really kind of all expected to be moving in the same content, on the same pace, on the same day for all of their learners, regardless of student needs. And I feel torn because I certainly believe that all learners should be held to high standards. I believe firmly that all educators should hold high expectations and that there's no student who can't achieve, given all the right supports. However, the hallmark of special education, which is my field, is the attention to the individual needs of students to access their education. So it's not that students can't necessarily learn, but how are we getting access if we're not able to accommodate it all for individualized needs? And I think sadly, a lot of the accountability movement was requiring everybody to have the same in the name of equality. But in this piece and in life, I try to point out that equality and equity are not the same. So everybody getting the same is not everybody getting what they need, because not everybody needs the same thing. And so this, one size fits all approach, generally in my own experience as a practitioner and in the experience I hear from the practitioners in my field and in the research I've done in this field as well, this one size fits all approach doesn't work for many of the same students that I'm interested in working with and that my students currently work with. And so that was the point I was trying to make there, not to dismiss how far we've grown since the accountability movement of all students having access to a general education curriculum, all students being held to high standards. However, expecting that all to look the same way will never work as long as we have, this concept of meeting students in their individual needs.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think with the focus on individualizing education for students with disabilities or with special needs, because they need this support, there's no way to put standardization and individualization in the same conversation. Like, how does that fit together, making everyone.
Well, and I believe I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I believe we can do a better job in navigating that, but I think assuming that everybody will be all will ever be the same is just not going to work.
Right, and I think we definitely see that deficit view in a lot of capacities, because especially in the classroom, the minute a student comes in the classroom, you're given a roster of their previous test scores and their current level. And the minute you see that child is below level, you're thinking about their deficits. You're not thinking about all the positive things, attributes that those children are bringing to the table.
Yeah, that's an important point, Maria. And it's not to dismiss that point, but I think there's a danger in thinking a student can't achieve something, certainly. So seeing, getting a story about a student before you've had the opportunity to work with them and making assumptions. However, there's also, I think, a risk in saying that all fourth grade students will be mastering this same content at the same pace at the same time. Not to say that all of your fourth graders can't, but to assume that all will in the same way is also, not not quite in line with what we value about special education.
Definitely, I agree. So we know that studying diversity and equity issues can be very challenging. What challenges have you faced and how have you overcome them? So in other words, are there keys to success that you would share with junior scholars that are interested in similar research?
So yeah, I think for me personally, I mentioned this earlier, if I was trying to publish my work in more mainstream journals, sometimes I'd actually get notes from the editors saying, oh, we don't think X journal is the right fit. Have you considered Y journal? And those were more of the fringy or, not as mainstream journals to publish this work. So I did, grow my name in my career as a junior faculty member, and I published quite a bit about teacher ed and special education. And I was still conducting my research. All of the research I've done pretty much has been in Miami-Dade County. So it's always been urban in the sense that my participants, whether they're students or teachers, my participants have always been from minoritized backgrounds and in urban settings. So that's stayed the focus of my work, even when I was publishing in the more mainstream journals, but I was focusing and relying, I think, more on the data I was finding and reporting, rather than really digging very deeply sometimes into my arguments and my interpretations of what I was finding, because I wanted to make sure I could be published in some of these more mainstream journals. So I think over time, I've cultivated my confidence enough, or maybe built enough of a name to be able to publish more critical pieces. Like the 2018 piece you mentioned is actually one of my favorite pieces, and it's really just a critical piece. But it took a while for me to get to that point in my career where I felt confident enough or comfortable enough to do that. I do think that, for junior scholars with similar research ideas, I think having that confidence to make your arguments and don't be afraid to allow your voice to shine. I think we are in an era where people are respecting that critical approach more than they did when I was starting out 20 years ago. And I think there's something to be said about having confidence in your own voice. I tell you this as a student, Maria, all the time, and anybody who's ever had a class with me knows, back it up in the research literature, certainly, but don't be afraid to rely on your voice as well as a scholar, and to have thoughts about the things you're seeing, especially when they're as, disturbing as some of the things we see in this field, and not shying away from digging more deeply into those arguments.
That's definitely good advice. It's a little hard to take, to be challenged, but I'm appreciative, and I'm sure many of your students are appreciative of you giving us that opportunity to challenge these things a little bit and encourage us to push a little bit deeper. So you have had various roles with the Council for Exceptional Children, and I know that you have held offices specifically in the Florida CEC division. So how do you think the work with CEC has benefited your research? And then I'll ask the next question. Let's start with that first.
Okay, sure. So, as you mentioned, I was past presidential ascension at the state CEC level. I also have a past presidency and an ascension on the board for DDEL as well. So those two factors, and I've been involved with TED since I'm a doc student. I think the best way that they've benefited my research is really in the connections I've made with other scholars, the relationships and connections I made with people with similar interests and passions as my own to form kind of that collaborative network.
Okay, so the Diversity Caucus, we focus on advocating and speaking more about diversity, equity, inclusion. So what do you see as the role of organizations such as the Diversity Caucus in navigating the challenges of research?
So I think it allows a space for people with these common interests to really connect, to support each other, to lift up emerging scholars and junior faculty members, and to form these, not just the relationships, but these collaborative professional relationships, because I think there's a certain strength in numbers. And so being brave and doing some of the things I was answering in one of my previous questions about, letting your voice shine and taking critical approaches, I think it's safer to do when you're doing them amongst company of other scholars and maybe even some more well-established scholars in the field who you can share that voice and have more strength and confidence in speaking about these issues.
So I have one final question for you. Sure. Who are the up and coming scholars that you are reading, and what do you find most compelling about their scholarship?
I love this question. Well, I love to do a lot of reading, especially the work of new scholars, especially female scholars of color. I do have several names I read. I hope I don't actually butcher any of these names, because some of them I've seen in print and not heard out loud. So forgive me if anybody is hearing this and I'm butchering anybody's name. First off, I've been reading everything that Mildred Boveda writes. I have to do a little shout out and brag because she's one of our alum here at FIU, but I really love her work and her writing around intersectionalities. This is an area where I've just been reading a ton and kind of shifted my own way I think about disproportionality and the nuances, really more around these intersectionalities. I've also been doing a lot of reading of Catherine Volgarides, I'm not exactly sure how it's said, Talcia Gonzalez, and both Talcia Gonzalez and Adai Tefra at University of Arizona. They're both doing amazing work. I think what all of these scholars I'm reading have in common is they're really digging into these complexities. Like I was talking about digging deeply, digging into the complexities around intersectionalities and equity research. And they're applying multidisciplinary lenses to this work. They're thinking outside of special ed, even outside of education in many cases, and really attacking some of these issues in perspectives that I wasn't even thinking about at their stage of my career. So I'm really impressed by that deep thinking, those interdisciplinary collaborations, and really, really critically diving from various approaches into these issues. So keep an eye.
Well, Dr. Cramer, on behalf of the TED Diversity Caucus, I really do want to extend our thanks again for your time and supporting this project that we're working on.
Well, and I appreciate you and the team who's behind this and putting this together. I hope it can be helpful for plenty of emerging scholars and others in the field.